In this recording, we're going to continue on and look at another aspect of strategic cost management, particularly the other developments, more recent developments in cost management. So in addition to customer profitability analysis, management accounting has brought out extra tools or new techniques to help with modern business problems. Two of those we're going to look at with examples here in terms of life cycle costing and target costing. And I'm going to give you a list at the end then of other developments that have happened over the last 2 or 3 decades, which again may help you with that self-directed research part of the continuous assessment as well. So life cycle costing initially as the first one, this is really looking at the whole life cycle of a product. And this will apply very much to like the pharmaceutical companies, car manufacturers, say for example, software developers, where traditionally management accounting, we always focused on the period post-design, that once the product is manufactured, we look at the ongoing manufacturing cost, i.e. how much does it cost to make the product and how much does it cost to sell it. What we kind of ignore to some extent is, well, was there a lot of development costs up front in designing it, coming up with the concept, prototypes, etc. Because all of those costs have to be covered as well. And what we're also ignore is end of life cycle. So for example, when we stop selling the product, there can still be maintenance, support if you're software, there can still be end of life costs if you're car, etc., that you need to take account of. So if the product is to be profitable over its full life, we need to look at this concept of life cycle costing. And this will be similar enough to total cost of ownership you might have come across if you're dealing with software as well. So life cycle costing here, the logic is, and this is a nice graphic, is the cost incurred, which is this black line, right, is different than the cost committed. So their argument is up to 80% of the costs can be committed in the design phase. So depending on how you design the manufacture of a car, depending on how you design a piece of software, how you make or build or design or formulate a drug, can commit costs for the manufacturing and end of life phase. So it's important that you understand the whole life cycle when you make a decision. So for example, you make a decision here to put in a particular type of engine in a car, or to put in a particular type of glass or particular type of suspension system. That can commit costs in the manufacturing phase in terms of where you're going to source that material, or the end of life phase when you may have to dispose of particular material that were involved in the manufacturing process. So life cycle costing tries to draw attention, more attention, into how important the design phase is. And it can also draw attention that these costs that are incurred in the design phase, they have to be covered as well when you go to the selling phase. Because if you don't cover these costs, again, they're not going to have a profitable product, and you're not going to have enough resources to reinvest in the next tranche of products. Right? So the part here is at the design and planning stage, you need to identify the amount, the timing, and costs. And look, that can be difficult because there can be alterations. But the point is, it gets people thinking about, hold on, if we commit to this now, what does that mean for next year? What does that mean for post year end or post sale service? Is it going to complicate things? So it is good for thinking ahead in terms of the whole life cycle cost, but it's also good to give I suppose, a focus on, take for example, pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceuticals could spend billions of euro every year on research. They might only have 2 out of 10 products to be a success, but those 2 out of 10 products have to cover the design costs and the development costs of all the failed products as well. So in the whole life cycle of it, there is that subsidization that you only expect a certain portion of your products to be successful, but you still need to research to figure out which ones they are. And that research costs need to be covered as well. So you can look at it from multiple different perspectives, how this principle of life cycle costing can be very helpful. And that if you make bad decisions here around the procurement, around the type of product, the type of raw material that's put in, or the type of labor, maybe it's a very labor intensive process, that can end up costing you an awful lot of money, which you can't change in the manufacturing and the end of life phase. So small things, it's a different dynamic that management accountants developed uh, in core with other areas that came up with it, that you're looking at, well, how can we use this then to inform decision making? Whether it's about deciding what way we design the next car, what way we design the next drug, that we have the best information in terms of pricing and costing as well. So it is one that gives you kind of more effective cost management, because if you put that focus in early on, that can help save a lot of money in the manufacturing. Because if something is in the design of a car, is in the design of a piece of software, that may not be able to be changed when you get to the selling and manufacturing phase, or the operations phase it's called. And it may actually complicate things at the end of life phase as well, where you're trying to remove this element or remove this car or remove this drug or remove this piece of software. So it is important. That's a nice mindset to have quite early on when you're in product development. The other one that helps as well is target costing, particularly when you're looking at the design phase. You're trying to figure out, well, instead of using the accountant's approach where you say, well, let's determine the cost of the product using your direct and indirect cost, as we've done in week 2, and then you say, right, I want to earn a markup of 10% or a margin of 20%, and then you can essentially figure out what price you need to charge. Now that's very much an internal view of pricing, because you don't actually understand or take into account, well, what are our competitors charging? What is the relevant price point that the market can take? So target costing is what we often call the marketer's approach to costing, because they go out initially and they say, hold on, let's look at what retail price point we want to get to. So we want to be in this price point, mid-range or premium or or value, and then you work back. So you essentially focus on the target cost equals what's the price, and that will depend on what the market can hold, what consumers are willing to pay. So it might involve market research, competitor analysis, and then you take off your target profit. And once you have that, that will mean we need to make it for this. So you actually set a target of what we need to build it for. And that these can relate together. Like you can use target costing as part of your life cycle costing. So you back in, this is what we need to make it for. So this is how we're going to design it to make sure the costs don't overrun in the manufacturing and operating phase. All right. So the focus is not solely internal, it is involved in the external stakeholders. And what makes this tricky is you're going to need a multidiscipline team. So you're going to need accountants to figure out what the target profit is and the target cost. You're going to look at marketeers to figure out what's the relevant price point in terms of doing market research. And we're going to need the operations, manufacturing, and design people to figure out, can we make it for this? Can we design it in a certain way that we can make it for this target cost? So it's quite an involved process, and it has to be done very early on in the product development. But it does involve a lot more proactive thinking rather than ending up here where you design something because you can, and then you realize, hold on, the market price is way out of whack in terms of what the market can bear, so we need to redesign it. Well, that can be quite tricky because you've already committed a load of costs based on your initial prototype. Whereas this can be a lot more proactive, looking at to identify problems early on and where you're working towards in terms of a target cost. So your steps with this will be figure out the price for market research, figure out the profit, and that will be depending on the company policy. Like you could have a profit in terms of a certain margin, a certain markup, and that will allow you to come back to calculate the target cost. So we need to make this car for €15,000 if we are to make the required profit and therefore charge the required price to the end consumer. And what that brings you back to then is this concept of value engineering, where you're looking to reduce costs and achieve a target cost. And what you do there is you figure out, well, let's look at each component as a kind of a decision package. Do we need to have auto steering? Do we need to have alloys? Do we need to have the sunroof? Do we need to have that size of an engine? And by value engineering, we're looking at the engineering decisions, i.e. which features go in and which don't, and the value they may be attached to the customer. So maybe by putting in this engineering feature, it will be able to charge you more. And that's a lot of the time where the menu-based pricing comes from in cars as well. Like if you want X, Y, and Z, if you want extra alloys, if you want the electric windows, if you want the GPS or the sat nav built in, all of those are extras because they're trying to value engineer to a baseline cost and then everything else to say, well, if that customer wants that, we won't make it mandatory because we might isolate people and remove them from the target market. Let's put a baseline product, and if they want extras, they can pay for it, or we can go up in stages. So you might have the value, Toyota Corolla, then you have the Supreme, and then you have the Elite, or whatever names that they have for each of those. And that's what kind of car dealerships are doing in terms of finding a price point for each of the baselines and then using tiered pricing or menu-based pricing to tailor to different customer desires. So there is a link there between your costing, which is going to be management accounting in any of those firms, and your market research about what customers want and how they purchase cars. Right? So when is it used? It usually takes place during the design phase because you want to have this information up front. So it does fit into the overall life cycle costing, right? And value engineering is a key part of that, where you're using that trade-off between the different functionality and the total cost. And that's where different engineers will come in, talking about the cost of putting in or taking out that function, and the product design team, and also the management accountant in terms of costing that and figuring out what impact that will have on the overall cost of the product. Right? But it's part of the overall packaging because you're going to need consumer research around what is the value, the critical functionality a car has to do that they want as a baseline, and then preferences, which leans to your, of course, your menu-based pricing. Right? So that's what we're talking about there, is looking at functional analysis. So what are the things that can be easily added or deleted from electronics? So you're sending a new TV, what's the mandatory or new laptop? Or it could be a set of car, it could be a whole host of things where you can do that special design analysis to take in and take out features and figure out the optimal cost and the optimal structure. And of course, even after that, there are other cost reduction strategies that you can look at in the design stage, whether it's you're looking at your Six Sigma, you're looking at efficiencies in the production line. There's all a host of other elements. Some of them are talked about here in controlling tomorrow's costs through today's design. That's a nice reading from Harvard Business Review. And there's some other notable techniques that I've just name dropped here intentionally because I want to see, will you pick some of those and think, actually, that might be quite interesting for me to research as part of the CA, or maybe that links very much to what we're doing in my role. I wouldn't mind digging deeper. So for example, total quality management and the cost of quality. If you're involved in manufacturing, particularly the likes of, for example, pharmaceutical manufacturing, the cost of quality is important because you can't have failures in quality of pharmaceuticals. But what is the cost of that? Like how many internal inspections do you have? Do you have failure costs in terms of having to redo batches, internal failures where they're captured within the production line, or do you have, which might be quite costly, external failures where a batch has to be recalled because there's some production problem with it? Benchmarking, whether that's benchmarking cost of operations across hospitals, benchmarking across police forces, or benchmarking profitability across company stores. That's a cost management technique where you can focus in on best practice and figuring out where other benchmarks are above or below that. Kaizen costing is a philosophy where they look at continuous improvement in costing, not just a once-off revamp of cost, but continuously improving, and that feeds into organizational culture as well. The value chain analysis, which you'll look at if you look at your Ryanair reading from this week, focusing on cost management right throughout the value chain, not just on one aspect in operations, but in procurement, in HR, in marketing. How can we reduce our costs and improve our efficiencies right across that value chain? Business process reengineering, which links to your operations module, which will be, I think, next year, but also it linked to the likes of Six Sigma, just in time, that some of you may have experience of within your own roles. So anyone involved with operations may be more familiar with that. And a big area that's now coming to the fore in cost management is environmental accounting. Right? How can management accountants contribute to environmental reporting? Are we measuring carbon footprint? Are we measuring pollution? And how do we quantify that? And that's a big role of accountants. Like our job is to quantify things every day of the year. It's just another thing to quantify. How do we measure these environmental damage and the costs or the benefits? For example, if we're going to a hybrid delivery fleet, if we're going to LED light bulbs across the manufacturing plant, or for whatever way, the role of the accountant in trying to quantify that and improve decision making. So I said some of those, you might find other ones, and it's always good when you see in a CA that the students, the groups show in, I suppose, evidence of self-directed research, and they find something that's interesting and they can relate it back to the requirement. So don't be afraid to ask about any of those. And I think if you have another one that you found, you can always sense check it off me before you do go and do any significant amount of work for the CA. All right, so again, what I said is go back and have a look at that Ryanair reading. It's a very good one about cost reduction strategies right throughout the value chain. That gives you a good indication of how they're focused in every part of the business, how they can strategically reduce costs, but without damaging the customer experience. And that's a big thing that can happen. Sometimes it doesn't always get right, but if you're taking away costs, you have to have an impact on what longer term impact can this have. So short-term savings with long-term losses is not the right strategy here. It must be around strategic cost management. All right, so that was the extra piece for this week, focusing on the other developments of cost management, two of them in a bit of detail, life cycle costing and target costing, but we name drop another couple just for it to pique your interest to see will anything suit the continuous assessment for the module.